Hey guys, tonight we're slipping quietly into the bustling heart of a medieval town square, where the air is thick with the aroma of fresh bread, livestock droppings, and that one mysterious smell no one ever dares question. You're not here to buy a duck or haggle over onions, though your heart's doing that strange somersault thing because someone just caught your eye across the stalls. A flash of a linen veil, a glance from beneath a coif, and suddenly you're smitten in the least sanitary environment imaginable. You probably won't survive this. You might catch a disease before you even catch a name. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You spot them near the bread carter face you haven't seen before, or maybe one you've quietly admired from afar while pretending to inspect cheese. There's no dating app to swipe on, no mutual friends to casually ask, just the pulse of everyday life and an unspoken challenge. How do you begin? The market is the closest thing you have to a social mixer, especially if you're a peasant or tradesperson. These spaces were for buying, selling, gossiping and sometimes, if fate allowed, finding someone whose glance lingered just a second too long. People didn't date in the modern sense. The concept of casual romantic exploration was, well, non-existent. You weren't supposed to date, you were supposed to marry, and quickly, if possible, before anyone got any funny ideas. Still, the town market offered that brief chance to cross paths. And whether you were a cobbler's apprentice or the miller's shy daughter, your first romantic stirrings probably unfolded beneath fluttering awnings and the hawking of fish. The first step? Proximity. You loiter nearby, pretending to consider apples. If you're lucky, they don't immediately walk away or worse, get called back by their mother. That's when you might manage a bold good day, followed by nervous silence. Anything more forward could risk insult or, if overheard, gossip. But sometimes, you might catch a smile. That was enough to keep you daydreaming for days, or carving their initials into your wooden spoon. Historically, most courtships were orchestrated around daily life. That meant wherever people gathered, church, festivals, yes, even communal baths became silent stages for budding attraction. But the market square was king. It was semi-public, bustling, and crucially, plausible. No one could fault you for going to buy turnips, even if you circled past the same stall 3 times just hoping to make eye contact again. Quirkier traditions also crept into early flirtations. In some alpine villages, boys and girls would throw snowballs at each other as a courtship ritual, because apparently nothing says "marry me" like a good ice ball to the ear. And in more rural areas, youths might leave symbolic tokens in each other's homesan herb bundle tucked beneath a windowsill, or a hand-woven ribbon tied around a barn beam. Historians still argue whether markets encouraged more freedom or scrutiny. On one hand, they offered rare social mingling across genders. On the other, everything you did was under a dozen watchful eyes. Even a short exchange could be witnessed by your rival suitor, your neighbor, or someone who'd casually mention it at the next church confession. And let's not forget clothing. Appearance mattered. If you were a young man trying to catch someone's attention, you'd make sure your hose weren't patched too sloppily and that your jerkin was buttoned all the way up. If you were a young woman, your veil would be freshly laundered, or at least less grimy than yesterday. And maybe if you were feeling daring, you'd let a bit of your braid peek out. But above all, the most medieval thing about this whole dance was that nothing was ever guaranteed. You could flirt with someone over 3 market days, only to find out they were being betrothed to a neighbor's cousin next week, or they'd vanish entirely, sent off to help with harvest, or married off, or worse, taken ill. Romance lived and died fast in this world, often before it ever had a chance to bloom. And yet, you come back to the market every week, just in case you see them again. You catch sight of them again, this time near the candle maker's stall, where beeswax tapers are stacked like golden fingers. There's a flutter in your chest, but you don't dare call it love. Not yet. It's more like the warm thrill of possibility, the kind that blooms when someone you're not supposed to think about suddenly lingers within reach. The idea of dating, as you know it today, doesn't really exist. But there are rituals, gestures, customs, and candlelight helps everything feel a little more daring. You inch closer under the pretense of inspecting wick quality. Your fingers tremble slightly, and you make an offhand remark about the smoke from the tallow candles next to you. Maybe they respond, maybe not. But either way, it's a tiny thread connecting two people. One, you'll try to braid into something sturdier next time. Flirting in medieval times had to be subtle. A raised eyebrow, an accidental touch while passing in a narrow alley, the gifting of a token something handmade, perhaps a piece of ribbon or a sprig of rosemary. The rules were unspoken, but everyone knew them. Be too obvious, and you risk shame. Be too hesitant, and the moment slips away. And unlike modern dates at cafes or parks, most courtship here happened under the ever-watchful eyes of family, neighbours, or the town busybody who somehow always needed to buy onions when you were there. Still, there were moments. Glorious, candlelit moments. If you belonged to a wealthier household or served in one, you might attend a small evening gathering. Someone might bring a lute. Someone else might sing. These were rare and fragile occasions, like snowflakes that melted under too much scrutiny. Yet under their soft glow, people opened up. They shared glances, exchanged compliments dressed up as poetry, and sometimes slouched hands beneath the table. Scandalous. One mainstream historical fact is that in some parts of Europe, noblemen and women were trained in the arts of courtly love. This wasn't about marriage, it was about gallant behaviour, romantic idealism, and adoration from afar. Think knights penning poems for ladies they could never have. Most of these relationships were platonica, so the bards claimed, and involved months or years of longing. For you, a humble blacksmith's apprentice or dairymaid, this concept trickled down in simplified form. Show interest, behave honourably, and don't get caught doing anything you shouldn't. If you lived in a village, flirting might involve helping with chores, carrying a water bucket, offering to chop firewood, or leaving something small and thoughtful at someone's doorstep. These were the medieval equivalent of, "Can I walk you home?" Just much heavier on labour and blisters. Acts of service weren't just romantic, they were survival strategies that doubled as courtship rituals. But as always, there was risk. A flirtation gone wrong could ruin reputations, and rumours spread faster than fire through a thatched roof. One misplaced wink, and suddenly the priest was giving an extra long sermon on the dangers of temptation. It didn't help that flirting itself was sometimes seen as sinful. The church preferred chastity and restraint unless, of course, you were already betrothed and halfway through your marriage negotiations. Historians still debate how much freedom medieval people really had in choosing partners. Some argue there was more choice than we assume, at least among peasants. Others point out that even the illusion of choice was tightly bound by custom, status, and family interest. Either way, the slow burn of candlelight courtship offered a little room to breathe and dream. Imagine slipping a carved wooden button into someone's palm at a gathering, no words, just a glance. They take it, hold it, maybe smile. That moment alone might fuel your imagination for weeks, and if you're very lucky, it might mean they're hoping for more too. Then again, maybe you drop the button and it rolls straight under the feet of your crush's disapproving aunt. She gives you a glare that could curdle milk. You retreat face flushed, dignity in tatters. Romance in medieval times wasn't a fairy tale. It was candlelight and courage, awkwardness and hope. You kept trying anyway. Your breath catches again when you see them on the church steps, just standing there, speaking softly to a relative, the faint outline of a smile flickering like a secret. You freeze, not because you're afraid of them, but because of who's standing just a few feet away. Their father, a massive presence in a worn leather belt, arms folded, eyes scanning like a hawk searching for sinners. Welcome to medieval dating under surveillance. If you thought the market was stifling, wait until you realize that nearly every step of courtship in this world is shadowed by family, and not the kind that lets you make your own mistakes. No, in this time, love is a family affair, and not always a gentle one. You want to approach, you really do. But even speaking too long with someone of the opposite sex, especially if marriage hasn't already been agreed upon, is enough to raise eyebrows, tempers, or both. Parental approval isn't just a formality. It's the difference between a potential wedding and never seeing your crush again. Families have the power to shut it down instantly, and sometimes they don't even bother with explanations. You'll just stop seeing them around, and when you ask, people give vague shrugs and say things like, their uncle came for them, or they're helping cousins in another village. Just like that, the thread is cut. You try not to take it personally, but it's hard. In towns and manors, everyone watches everything. Younger siblings are notoriously loose-lipped, and servants love a good story. If you pass a note, expect the stable boy to read it. If you smile too long at the miller's daughter, the washerwomen will be discussing it before the linens are dry. You can't afford to mess this up. Not because you're reckless, but because they're worth it even if your only real conversation so far was about pigs. Even more fun? Your parents are watching you just as closely. For them, your potential spouse isn't just about love, it's about alliances, property, labor, and sometimes saving face. If you're lucky, your family wants you to be happy. But happy in medieval times often translated to, can they work a field? Or, do they own at least one goat? Emotional compatibility rarely made it onto the checklist. Marriage was economic, strategic, sometimes desperate. That doesn't mean people didn't fall in love, but they had to do it under conditions that made the tiniest affection feel like an act of rebellion. There were rare exceptions. Some regions allowed limited autonomy, especially among peasants, whose marriages might not be arranged with the same rigidity as the nobility. But even then, parents played a crucial role. You'd likely still need their blessing. And even if you loved someone with your entire heart, if your mother disapproved, things could turn grim fast. In some households, the father would even be the one to arrange a spying system, using younger children to report back anything suspicious. Romantic, right? And if your crush belonged to a merchant family, or had wealth tied to inheritance, the entire affair became even more scrutinized. Daughters were bargaining chips. Sons were expected to marry up. Suddenly, your personal longing was weighed against land rights, dowries, and family honor. In some cultures, contracts were drawn up before two people had exchanged more than 2 sentences. The concept of falling in love first, marrying later, would have been laughable to many, yet people tried, quietly, bravely. One mainstream fact? In many medieval towns, courtship customs included family-arranged, witnessed, meetings, essentially monitored visits where the couple could talk, but only in full view of others. No touching, no lingering glances, and definitely no sneaking away. A chaperone, often a stern aunt or cousin, would sit nearby like a boulder, sipping weak ale and pretending not to listen while memorizing every word. If you passed this phase, and both families approved, things could move forward. If not, well, better luck next village. Still, love finds cracks in the mortar. It always has. That's where the whispers start. The secret tokens, the shared chores. Maybe you offer to help your crush's family bring in the harvest. Maybe your mother casually mentions how helpful you've been lately. Slowly, over time, resistance softens. Maybe her father isn't glowering quite as much. Maybe your sister says they asked about you. That's something. Fringe traditions varied wildly depending on region. In some parts of medieval Wales, for instance, there was a custom called bundling, where 2 people could sleep together fully clothed, often sewn into bag sand, just talk. In theory, some historians believe it was a practical way for rural folks to get to know one another during long winter nights without breaking the rules. Others argue whether it was more temptation than tradition. Either way, it's one of those bizarre customs that reminds you how strange and surprisingly flexible medieval romance could be, depending on who's watching. Historians still debate whether medieval parental control over romance was absolute, or if people found clever ways around it more often than we think. Some records show that runaway couples weren't uncommon. In fact, some villages had entire ceremonies for elopements, often followed by forced reconciliation with the angry families later. But that initial burst of freedom, that shared decision to choose each other, must have been intoxicating. You step away from the church, heart still thudding, trying to act like you weren't just planning an imaginary life together based on a single conversation about candles. Their father didn't scowl. Not this time. Maybe, just maybe, the wall is starting to crack. And even if it's not, you've learned to play the long game. Because in this world, love takes patience, stealth, and the ability to survive a dozen awkward interactions while pretending you're not head over heels. You don't have parchment or a feather quill. You don't even have the luxury of sending a messenger boy. But somehow, you need to say something to let them know you're thinking of them, even if words can't be spoken aloud. So you do what many medieval romantics did before you. You turn to symbols, codes, and quiet, clever gestures. Because in a world where love letters were risky, private communication had to be disguised as something else entirely. Let's say you weave a small scrap of red thread into a favora token of affection. You drop it near their path while carrying hay or placing candles at the church altar. If they recognize the meaning and tuck it away, it's a sign. They feel something too. But if they leave it behind, or worse, their sibling picks it up and teases them about it, you might have to pretend it was just an accident. In medieval dating, deniability was everything. Words carried weight, but only if they were hidden in safe containers. Lovers used prayer books to pass messages, slipping small scraps of verse between psalms, where no one but the right eyes would dare look. Poetry was a favoured method. If you had any education at Allah, just a talent for mimicry, you might scrawl a few clumsy lines of love in rhyme, signing only with a carved symbol. Was it elegant? Maybe not. But it was earnest. And in a world full of dirt and duty, that kind of tenderness could melt even the sternest heart. A mainstream historical fact? In the courts of medieval France and England, entire poems were composed in secret alphabets or acrostics, the first letters of each line spelling out names or intentions. In wealthier circles, this practice was refined into courtly verse, often shared between knights and noble ladies. Among the lower classes, simpler symbols like a braided strand of hair or pressed flower petals served the same purpose. Frenge tidbits, gediemstranger. In some pockets of rural Germany, young men would carve cryptic messages into tree bark, hoping the object of their affection might wander past, decode the message, and respond with a flower pinned to the bark the next morning. It sounds romantic until you realize you've carved your heart into a birch tree, and the next rainstorm washes your poetry into the mud. Still, you try. Historians still argue whether these covert methods were common or exaggerated by surviving folklore. Some believe most messages were oral, passed discreetly through mutual friends or whispered during stolen moments. Others point to existing artifacts, embroidered love tokens, etched rings, and folded parchment fragments as proof that people poured enormous effort into finding safe, hidden ways to say what they couldn't voice in public. You try it yourself. You gather up courage and carve a symbol into a small bit of wood or heart beside the faint outline of a dove, something simple yet unmistakable. Then you tuck it into the basket of your crush's sibling when no one's watching. Risky? Extremely. But in this world, fortune doesn't favour the brave so much as the quiet, the cautious, the clever. Days pass. No word. You pretend you're not checking every time they walk by. Then one morning, you find a dried lavender sprig on the church step, tied with a red thread. No name, no explanation, but you know. It's not a reply, it's a vow. I see you too. These silent exchanges are everything. In a society so tightly wound with propriety, the smallest acknowledgement of affection becomes a firework. People weren't cold, they were just careful. And those who dared to step even a little outside the accepted boundaries had to be creative, subtle, and fearless in the smallest of ways. Sometimes, an entire relationship could be built on such signals: a glance during Mass, a shared chore at harvest, a dance during a festival that lingered just long enough to hint at more. It wasn't unusual for people to be deeply emotionally involved before ever being permitted to touch, let alone speak freely. And when you finally did get to speak without barriers, it was overwhelming. Every word was precious, chosen, memorized. No one was checking their phone mid-conversation. There were no distractions. Just eye contact and heartbeat, and the knowledge that even this moment might be stolen away. But it didn't always go as planned. Maybe you write a note, and it ends up in the wrong hands. Maybe a jealous rival intercepts your token and mocks it in front of others. These mishaps could mean embarrassment at best or at worst, harsh consequences from family or church officials. You had to be careful not just for your own sake, but for theirs. Reputation, in medieval dating, was like spun glass and cracked, rarely repairable. You start to dream a little more boldly. You wonder if they dream too, about fields walked hand in hand, about houses built with shared labour, about waking beside someone who knows your true self, not just the one you wear in public. You cling to those dreams while feeding chickens, mending boots, or hauling sacks of grain, mundane chores softened by the memory of that lavender sprig. And you understand something important now. Medieval romance isn't about grand gestures or public declarations. It's about secrets that flutter like moth wings in the dark, about building trust, one coded glance at a time. You have no parchment poem sealed with wax, but you have hope. And in this world, that's more than enough to keep going. You're not supposed to be alone with them. You're not supposed to think the thoughts you've been thinking, or feel the heat rising in your cheeks when they brush past you on the path from the well. But you do, and they do too. The problem is, so does everyone else. In your village, eyes are everywhere, and even the stones seem to whisper if you linger too long near someone you're not married to. Reputation isn't just personal here. It's public property. Everyone has a stake in it. And losing yours doesn't just hurt, it can ruin your life. You'd think something as simple as holding hands might be harmless, but no. If someone saw, if the wrong rumor spread, if an elder muttered the word improper, your name could be smeared faster than mud after a rainstorm, especially if you're a young woman. Virtue isn't just prized, it's patrolled. And virginity? That's considered a family's greatest asset. Lose that before marriage, and you might as well pack a bundle and leave at dawn. Or worse, stay and bear the shame like a scarlet thread sewn into your daily life. For a man, it's a little different, but not by much. You're expected to be honorable, restrained, and to keep your distance unless you're serious. Even a flirtatious reputation can draw sneers and suspicion. No one wants to be the parent of the village roguie or worse, have their daughter tangled up with him. A single accusation, even without proof, can be enough to bar you from marriage, and once whispers start, they rarely stop. It wasn't just a social issue either. There were legal and religious consequences tied to impropriety. One mainstream historical fact: in many parts of medieval Europe, fornication, defined as sexual relations outside marriage, was punishable by both civil and ecclesiastical courts. Fines, public penance, even flogging were not uncommon. Some towns made couples walk through the streets wrapped in coarse cloth, holding candles as townsfolk jeered. You might say, walk of shame, had very literal origins. Still, people found ways around the restrictions. There were quiet corners, barn lofts, abandoned mills, and winding woods that held more secrets than any chapel. And while the church did its best to install fear, love and lust often ignored sermons. Couples met in shadows. They whispered behind hedges. And sometimes, things went further than either of them intended. In some regions, there was even a tradition of bedding previews, especially in the more remote rural areas. Families would tolerate premarital intimacy if the couple was engaged, and it sealed the match. Of course, if pregnancy followed, marriage had to come swiftly, not at all. One fringe tidbit? In a few communities, there existed something called chivalry, a raucous public ritual where neighbors would mock or shame couples who were suspected of inappropriate behavior. They'd bang pots, mimic barnyard noises, even dress in ridiculous costumes and parade past the offending house. It was half justice, half medieval comedy show, but if you were on the receiving end, it could be devastating. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly as morally strict as records suggest, or whether the laws and sermons reflect an ideal that was rarely lived. Some point to letters and folk songs that hint at much more relaxed attitudes, especially among the young and poor, who had less to lose and more to gain from passionate attachments. Others note that chroniclers and clergy had their own reasons for emphasizing virtue, often to reinforce authority and maintain control over rapidly growing towns and shifting social structures. So here you are, standing beside them in the twilight, just close enough to feel the warmth of their arm. Neither of you speaks. You don't dare. But the silence hums with shared thoughts, shared risk. You think of the others who've been caught, shamed, exiled. But you also think about the ones who made it, who turned these secret meetings into lifelong bonds against all odds. Later, while you're helping your mother grind herbs or stoking the hearth fire, the memories linger like smoke in your clothes. You wonder if they're thinking of you too, if they remember the flicker of your hand brushing theirs, if they noticed how you looked away too quickly, or not quickly enough. You start to behave more carefully. You walk a longer route just to avoid crossing paths at suspicious times. You stop smiling as much in public, save it all for the privacy of your mind. But your feelings don't dim, they deepen. Because when you have to fight for every moment, every stolen second becomes gold. There's no such thing as casual affection here. It's all or nothing. A look that lasts too long could be everything. And yet, somehow, you keep finding each other. Not by plan, but by instinct. You end up at the well at the same time. You both linger after evening prayers. You both pause beneath the same sycamore, pretending to enjoy the breeze, when all you really want is to stand beside each other in peace. You learn to communicate with the tiniest gesture. Show they hold their basket, how they tilt their head. You begin to understand that love, in this world, is coded, constrained, but not crushed. It survives by shrinking into spaces no one can see. You go to bed that night, staring at the rafters, listening to the hoot of a distant owl. Tomorrow, you'll be watched again, judged, measured. But for a few minutes this evening, you were just two people beneath a tree, breathing the same air, hearts humming with quiet defiance. You don't even bother pretending anymore, not to yourself anyway. You're in deep. You think about them in the morning when you light the fire, at midday when you're hauling water, and in the stillness of night when every creak of the house sounds louder than it should. But even your dreams come with limits, because you're painfully aware of something that casts a long shadow over everything you feel. Your family doesn't approve, and neither does theirs. Why? Class, status, lineage, maybe even something as absurd as the type of work you do. It hardly matters. The divide feels unbridgeable. This is the heartbreak that hums beneath so many medieval love stories. No matter how strong your feelings, crossing social boundaries wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. You've always known that you were a blacksmith's daughter, or a shepherd's son, or someone else with strong hands and honest work, but no name that carried weight. And they? Maybe they're the Reeves kin, or the daughter of a prosperous merchant, someone just high enough that your union would be called improper. Misalliance, they might say, as if love were a transaction, and not something felt in the marrow. You try to forget. You really do. You focus on your chores. You speak when spoken to. You pretend it's fine. But when you see them again, maybe catching your eye across the church pews or standing silently in the shade of the old yew tree, you feel it all come crashing back. That warmth, that longing, and that helpless ache that settles somewhere between your ribs and your throat, because they look back, and you know they feel it too. In wealthier circles, marriages were often arranged years in advance, with formal contracts and dowries negotiated like trade agreements. One mainstream historical fact: among the nobility, it wasn't uncommon for children to be betrothed as young as 7 or 8, with the actual wedding taking place in their early teens. Love had little to do with it. Marriage was business, meant to secure land, loyalty, and legacy. But even among commoners, class distinctions mattered. A well-to-do merchant might not want their son marrying a thatcher's daughter, even if the two had grown up feeding chickens side by side. It wasn't impossible, though. There were exceptions. Some towns had more flexible boundaries, especially where tradespeople thrived and upward mobility was possible. If you could prove your worth through skill, loyalty, or wealth, you might slowly earn approval. But that took time, luck, and a good deal of patience. And until then, you were stuck in limbo, where every glance had to be stolen and every conversation cloaked in polite neutrality. That's when the letters start again, or the tokens, something to reassure each other that the connection is still there. A folded piece of cloth with a symbol sewn into the corner, a sprig of mint or thyme left on a doorstep. You pass them like spies, hiding evidence before it can be found. And yet, even with all your caution, the gossip begins. It always starts with whispers. Maybe someone saw you talking too long at the well. Maybe a sibling made an offhand remark at dinner. Whatever it was, now there's a stain that everyone seems to notice. You get a longer scolding than usual from your father. Your chores are doubled. You're told to keep your distance, though no one says the name aloud. They don't have to. You can see it in their faces. You've overstepped. One fringe tidbit: in certain rural areas of Scandinavia, young couples who defied social expectations might participate in a ritual known as night running. It involved escaping together under cover of darkness, finding sanctuary in another village, and pleading for acceptance as a pair. If the local elders agreed, they might be allowed to stay and marry. If not, they'd be returned or worse, punished. It was rare, it was bold, but sometimes it worked. Historians still argue whether these cross-class romances were romanticized later by poets and playwrights, or whether they truly happened more often than the records suggest. Documentation is scarce, and love leaves few paper trails when it hides in corners. But oral histories, songs, and the odd bit of carved graffiti suggest that these stories weren't just fantasy. People tried. They fought for each other in quiet, stubborn ways. You think about it, sometimes leaving, running, finding another village, a new life, somewhere no one knows your name or your station. But it's a fantasy. You have responsibilities. A younger sibling who needs you. A parent who leans on you for work. And they? They have obligations too. A family with expectations. Maybe a pre-arranged match you've heard whispers about. You can't just vanish. And yet, the festival's coming. A holy day. There'll be music, dancing, sweetmeats and bonfires. For a single evening, the usual rules loosen their grip. People wear masks, drink wine, smile more freely. You know you'll see them there. You plan what to wear, something clean, something nice, maybe a ribbon if you can find one. You tell yourself not to hope, but it flickers behind your eyes anyway. And on the night itself, when lanterns sway from ropes and children chase one another with sugar-sticky hands, you catch sight of them. They're alone, just for a moment, standing near the edge of the square, where the firelight doesn't quite reach. Your heart pounds. You step toward them, breath hitching, and they turn. The look they give you is the kind that softens everything. It says, "I see you. I remember. I still feel it too." You don't talk long, you can't. But you exchange a few words, maybe a smile, maybe even a hand briefly clasped behind the curtain of shadows. And in that moment, for once, class and consequence don't exist. There's only you and them, and the soft sound of music in the distance, rising and falling like a promise neither of you dares to speak aloud. You part before anyone notices, return to your side of the fire, pick up a plate, laugh at a joke, pretend nothing just happened, but inside, something new glows. A stubborn hope, a tiny rebellion. Because even if you can't have a future not the kind you dream of, you still had this. And maybe, just maybe, it won't be the last time. The festival is over, but the memory lingers. The way their fingers brushed yours in the shadows. The way they smiled without saying much, as if any more would have cracked the fragile barrier between what is and what can never be. You return to your usual routine, but everything feels different now. The world has grown sharper, heavier, because you've tasted something real, something tender, and you can't unfeel it. But just as your hopes begin to stretch their wings, reality closes in. The sermons get louder, the gossip circles tighter, and soon, it's not just your parents you need to worry about, it's the church. Clergy have always kept an eye on village life. Priests, monks, friars. They're not just there to conduct weddings and hear confessions. They're also moral watchdogs, sworn to guide the flock and keep temptation at bay. That means your little flirtations, however discreet, are now officially on their radar. It might be something small, a glance during Mass, a too-long conversation after Vespers, or maybe the local priest just has a sixth sense for sin. Either way, you start to notice things. The pause in his tone when he addresses your family, the way he lingers after sermons to remind everyone that chaste thoughts lead to clean hearts. You know who that message is for. Everyone does. The church has rules for everything. When you can marry, who you can marry, how long you have to wait after a spouse dies before marrying again. And of course, what constitutes a sin? Holding hands before betrothal? Questionable. Kissing? Scandalous. Anything beyond that? You'd better hope there's a confessional open. And soon. One mainstream historical fact. By the 12th century, the Catholic Church had firmly declared marriage a sacrament, and with that came tighter control. You couldn't just decide to marry someone, you needed approval. You needed to follow form. And if you didn't, there were consequences both spiritual and social. If your relationship is discovered and deemed inappropriate, you could be assigned public penance. That might mean attending Mass barefoot, kneeling outside the church door with a candle, or worse, being called out during service by name. A sermon becomes a stage, and your feelings become the villain. But not all consequences are public. Sometimes it's more insidious. You might be barred from communion, your family might lose favor in the community, or you might suddenly find your household under unexpected scrutiny, from tithes to trades to how much ale your father drinks on feast days. Still, people persist. Love, like water, finds cracks in even the most fortified walls. You begin to meet in safer places, not in the woods that's too risky, but in shared public spaces with just enough crowd to give cover. The mill, maybe, the back pew, even the fields during harvest. You work side by side without speaking much, but every shared glance, every silent moment, says what words cannot. You've grown fluent in a language of restraint, in the way your eyes linger when they speak, in the breath you don't take when they smile. One fringe tidbit? In certain corners of medieval Ireland, couples would attend hand-fasting ceremonies, informal betrothal rites, where two people pledged themselves to one another without a priest. It was seen as valid for a year and a day, after which they could marry formally or part ways without penalty. The church, unsurprisingly, tried to stamp this out, but it persisted in rural areas well into the early modern period. The idea that two people could bind themselves by mutual consent, however temporarily, was radical and deeply human. Historians still debate how much authority the church really had over every aspect of love and marriage. In cities and noble courts, yes, their power was immense. But in small villages, where priests were overworked and records were scant, things slipped through. Elopements, secret unions, and whispered promises made beneath moonlight often occurred beyond ecclesiastical reach. Not everything was caught. Not everything could be. You begin to wonder, what if you both left? Not a dramatic escape, just a quiet departure. A move to another village where no one knows you. A cousin in the next shire. A distant uncle in need of labour. You talk about it once carefully, cautiously. They mention a nearby town with open land and a new market. You nod. Neither of you says the word run, but it hovers there between you, delicate and dangerous. But there's a new wrinkle. Rumours are swirling that their parents are arranging a match. Someone with more land, a better trade. Not rich, but respectable. The kind of person who wouldn't need to sneak glances or pass tokens under bread baskets. It's not official yet, but it feels like a countdown has begun. Every time you see them now, it's like water slipping through your fingers. You cling to each moment harder, knowing they're finite. You try not to let the sadness show. You work harder. You keep your head down, but you can feel yourself unraveling. Even the jokes don't land the same anymore. Someone teases you about being moony-eyed, and instead of laughing it off, you bite back a little too sharply. The tension is getting to you. Everyone can feel it. One afternoon, as you're gathering kindling near the woods, they appear quiet, serious. They don't say much, but their presence says everything. You stand together under a tree that's seen 100 seasons and likely a dozen love stories just like yours. They press something into your hand, a small carved disc, warm from their pocket. A symbol etched into the wood. Yours, theirs, both. You don't cry, but it's close. Then they go. No promises, no dramatic goodbyes. Just a final look that tells you, no matter what happens, this was real. That night, you kneel for evening prayers with your family, your hands folded tight, heart thudding. You don't ask for miracles, just peace, just the strength to carry this feeling without letting it ruin you. Because the church may not bless what you've shared, and the village may never understand it, but in your heart, it was never wrong, just impossible. The seasons shift. The air grows colder, the wind thinner, and the leaves fall like tiny paper prayers you never got the chance to send. You've hardly seen them since that last moment beneath the tree, and yet their presence clings to you in the scent of pine smoke, the sound of clinking tools, the way a certain laugh in the crowd makes your head turn before you realize it's not them. You tell yourself to stop looking. You tell yourself to forget, but there's always something that pulls you back. And just when you think it might finally be over, the feast day arrives. In towns and villages across medieval Europe, feast days were a break from toil, a rare stretch of hours where work paused, roles softened, and people mingled more freely than usual. The church calendar was full of them, from saints' days to harvest festivals. And while they were officially religious, everyone knew what they really were: social gold mines. For a few precious hours, the usual restrictions lifted ever so slightly, and in that subtle softening of rules, young hearts like yours dared to beat a little louder. Feast day morning begins with Mass, of course, because the church always gets its due. You sit with your family, trying to look devout, but your eyes are scanning the crowd. They're not there. Not yet. You listen to the priest's voice rise and fall, like waves against your thoughts. He speaks of virtue, of patience, of divine timing. You nod along like everyone else, but your mind is somewhere else entirely beneath. A ribbon-draped tree, or standing beside a fire where songs are sung and eyes meet across the flickering dark. When the service ends, the town square comes alive. Stalls are set up, musicians warm their instruments, and the scent of roasted chestnuts mixes with spiced cider. You walk among the crowd with careful steps, pretending to browse while your stomach churns with equal parts hope and dread. This might be the last chance you get to speak to them before a match is arranged, before everything changes. And then, there they are, across the square, laughing softly with a cousin, wearing a tunic you've never seen before. Something nice, something chosen. Their eyes meet yours for the briefest second. It's all you need. You inch closer through the crowd, not directly, but in slow, drifting arcs. You greet others, accept a handful of sugared almonds, smile too much, but always, your steps are curving toward them. They're doing the same. The music starts pipes and fiddles, the sort of melodies that make even old knees twitch. Couples begin to dance in the wide circle at the center of the square. You see them step forward. They glance at you again, and then, casually, they choose a place on the edge of the dancing ring. They're inviting you, not with words, just with presence. You hesitate for a beat too long, then step into the circle. The dance isn't intimate, there's too much movement, too many eyes. But still, your hands find theirs briefly in the pattern. Your shoulders brush as you turn. The music covers everything. You speak without speaking. When the dance ends, you don't linger. You walk away first, not because you want to, but because you have to. Appearances matter, even now. A mainstream historical fact. Festivals in the medieval world were one of the few times young people could interact more freely. Dances like the carol or farandole involved hand-holding, coordinated movements, and even playful teasing. These events often served as informal courtship venues, where couples could show interest without directly disobeying social rules. But even these moments were watched, judged, and in some cases, gossiped about relentlessly the next day. Still, the sheer volume of people, music, and chaos created rare pockets of privacy. You find one by accident, a narrow alley between the bakehouse and the old storeroom, where the music sounds distant and the air smells faintly of cinnamon. You turn, and there they are, standing a few paces away, alone. You both laugh nervously, softly, like the air might shatter if you breathe too loudly. You speak finally, not in code, not in glances, but real words. You talk about the dance, about the feast, about the weather even. Then, gradually, about the heaviness that's grown between you since that last meeting. You don't say you miss each other. You don't need to. It's there, thick and humming in the silence between sentences. One fingertidbit? In some parts of rural France and Spain, couples would try to sneak away during festivals for what were called moon meetings, brief, hushed encounters, under the pretense of fetching water or taking a walk. These trysts weren't always romantic, but for many, they were the only real chance to be alone. Of course, if caught, the penalties could be severe. But if you weren't caught, well, it was enough to carry you through the next long season. Historians still argue how common these secret meetings really were. Church records often omit them unless scandal erupted. But folklore and song are full of such telestries of brief, bright encounters that defied the cold machinery of arranged marriage and social hierarchy. Whether they were fact or fiction, they resonated. They still do. You don't stay long in the alley, just enough to speak, to smile, to touch fingers briefly under the cover of a shared joke. Then you part, both of you knowing it's the last time things can feel this way, this free, this light, this hopeful. Tomorrow might bring a betrothal, or a reprimand, or a transfer to another village. But tonight? Tonight you danced. You spoke. You remembered why it all mattered in the first place. You returned to the crowd, to the food, and the laughter, and the endless hum of festival life. No one notices the blush on your cheeks. No one hears the beat of your heart over the drums. But you do, and maybe that's enough. For now, the seasons shift. The air grows colder, the wind thinner, and the leaves fall like tiny paper prayers you never got the chance to send. You've hardly seen them since that last moment beneath the tree, and yet their presence clings to you in the scent of pine smoke, the sound of clinking tools, the way a certain laugh in the crowd makes your head turn before you realize it's not them. You tell yourself to stop looking. You tell yourself to forget. But there's always something that pulls you back, and just when you think it might finally be over, the feast day arrives. In towns and villages across medieval Europe, feast days were a break from toil, a rare stretch of hours where work paused, roles softened, and people mingled more freely than usual. The church calendar was full of them, from saints' days to harvest festivals. And while they were officially religious, everyone knew what they really were: social gold mines. For a few precious hours, the usual restrictions lifted ever so slightly, and in that subtle softening of rules, young hearts like yours dared to beat a little louder. Feast day morning begins with Mass, of course, because the church always gets its due. You sit with your family, trying to look devout, but your eyes are scanning the crowd. They're not there. Not yet. You listen to the priest's voice rise and fall like waves against your thoughts. He speaks of virtue, of patience, of divine timing. You nod along like everyone else, but your mind is somewhere else entirely beneath a ribbon-draped tree, or standing beside a fire, where songs are sung and eyes meet across the flickering dark. When the service ends, the town square comes alive. Stalls are set up, musicians warm their instruments, and the scent of roasted chestnuts mixes with spiced cider. You walk among the crowd with careful steps, pretending to browse while your stomach churns with equal parts hope and dread. This might be the last chance you get to speak to them before a match is arranged, before everything changes. And then, there they are, across the square, laughing softly with a cousin, wearing a tunic you've never seen before. Something nice, something chosen. Their eyes meet yours for the briefest second. It's all you need. You inch closer through the crowd, not directly, but in slow drifting arcs. You greet others, accept a handful of sugared almonds, smile too much. But always, your steps are curving toward them. They're doing the same. The music starts pipes and fiddles, the sort of melodies that make even old knees twitch. Couples begin to dance in the wide circle at the center of the square. You see them step forward. They glance at you again. And then, casually, they choose a place on the edge of the dancing ring. They're inviting you, not with words, just with presence. You hesitate for a beat too long, then step into the circle. The dance isn't intimate. There's too much movement, too many eyes. But still, your hands find theirs briefly in the pattern. Your shoulders brush as you turn. The music covers everything. You speak without speaking. When the dance ends, you don't linger. You walk away first. Not because you want to, but because you have to. Appearances matter, even now. A mainstream historical fact, festivals in the medieval world were one of the few times young people could interact more freely. Dances like the carole or farandole involved hand-holding, coordinated movements, and even playful teasing. These events often served as informal courtship venues, where couples could show interest without directly disobeying social rules. But even these moments were watched, judged, and in some cases, gossiped about relentlessly the next day. Still, the sheer volume of people, music, and chaos created rare pockets of privacy. You find one by accident, a narrow alley between the bakehouse and the old storeroom, where the music sounds distant and the air smells faintly of cinnamon. You turn, and there they are, standing a few paces away, alone. You both laugh nervously, softly, like the air might shatter if you breathe too loudly. You speak, finally, not in code, not in glances, but real words. You talk about the dance, about the feast, about the weather even. Then, gradually, about the heaviness that's grown between you since that last meeting. You don't say you miss each other. You don't need to. It's there, thick and humming in the silence between sentences. One fringer tidbit? In some parts of rural France and Spain, couples would try to sneak away during festivals for what were called moon meetings, brief, hushed encounters under the pretense of fetching water or taking a walk. These trysts weren't always romantic, but for many, they were the only real chance to be alone. Of course, if caught, the penalties could be severe. But if you weren't caught, well, it was enough to carry you through the next long season. Historians still argue how common these secret meetings really were. Church records often omit them, unless scandal erupted. But folklore and song are full of such telestries of brief, bright encounters that defied the cold machinery of arranged marriage and social hierarchy. Whether they were fact or fiction, they resonated. They still do. You don't stay long in the alley, just enough to speak, to smile, to touch fingers briefly under the cover of a shared joke. Then you part, both of you knowing it's the last time things can feel this way, this free, this light, this hopeful. Tomorrow might bring a betrothal, or a reprimand, or a transfer to another village. But tonight you danced. You spoke. You remembered why it all mattered in the first place. You returned to the crowd, to the food and the laughter and the endless hum of festival life. No one notices the blush on your cheeks. No one hears the beat of your heart over the drums. But you do. And maybe that's enough. For now, the festival fades into memory, and with it, the last wisps of possibility that had clung to your days like morning mist. Now, life settles back into its usual rhythm, monotonous, steady, and safe. But safe doesn't mean painless. You still see them sometimes, but always from a distance. Always with someone else nearby. Their mother, their cousin, or worse, the person everyone suspects they're soon to marry. That person has a steady walk, clean boots, and a family that owns several sheep. It's the sort of match that makes perfect sense on paper, which of course makes it feel all the more unbearable. You throw yourself into work. It's the only thing that dulls the ache. The physical labor of medieval life demands everything: muscle, sweat, time. You scrub, lift, chop, mend. You fix your gaze on the ground, on your hands, on anything but them. You even start waking up earlier just to avoid crossing paths. Some mornings you succeed, others, not so much. But always, that shared silence lingers between you like something unsaid but never forgotten. And then, the talk begins. Matchmaking talk. Your parents mention it at dinner, casually, like they're commenting on the weather. You've come of age after all. It's time. They're not unkind, they even ask if there's anyone you've noticed, but you don't answer. Not because you don't want to, but because you know the truth won't help anyone. So you shake your head, you smile, you say you trust them, and in doing so, you set something in motion that you know you'll regret. Matchmaking in medieval times wasn't romantic. It was transactional, pragmatic, and above all, urgent. Life expectancy was short. A good match could mean survival. A bad one could drag an entire family into hardship. One mainstream historical fact? In many parts of Europe, the negotiation of dowries and bride prices was so important that entire legal contracts were drawn up before the couple had even spoken more than 2 words to one another. If you were a daughter, your family needed to offer something of valueland, livestock, a well-spun loom. If you were a son, you had to prove you could support a household. Love had little to do with it. Still, some matches turned out fine. People learned to live together, to share routines, to raise children, and navigate hardship with mutual respect. It wasn't love, as you imagined it, not the burning kind that makes your heart rattle in your chest, but it was companionship, and sometimes that was enough. And yet, sometimes, it wasn't. Some couples went years without speaking more than a few functional sentences. Some grew bitter. Some grew lonely, even with a partner lying beside them each night. The gamble was always there. Your match is proposed by a family friend. The boy is kind enough, hard-working, quiet. He blushes when he talks to you. You think he's afraid of saying something wrong. You don't dislike him. You just don't feel anything at all. But your parents are pleased. They talk of joining households, sharing tools, helping each other in the colder months. You nod. You don't protest. And deep down, you wonder whether this is how it ends, not with a choice, but with a quiet surrender. One fringe tidbit? In some Slavic villages, there were rituals in which a girl could publicly reject a suitor by handing him a carved radish instead of bread during the courtship phase. If he received the radish, he was meant to go away without protest. But sometimes he didn't, and sometimes the girl's family pressured her to reconsider. Even rejection, in this world, had to be navigated delicately. Historians still debate whether medieval women had more say in their matches than previously believed. Some argue that peasant girls, in particular, had greater influence within their own social class. Others maintain that economic pressures nearly always overruled personal preference. What's clear is that most young people, regardless of gender, were expected to compromise. Happiness was secondary to utility. The boy's family invites yours to dinner. You sit across from him, eating boiled barley and root vegetables while your father and his discuss the price of sheep. You try to smile. You try to seem interested. The boy tries too. He mentions that he can carve wood, that he's building a bench for his mother. He seems proud. You offer polite encouragement, but all the while, your thoughts drift to someone else's smile, someone else's voice, Someone who once placed a carved token in your hand like it meant something. And then, days later, you see them again. The one you wanted, the one you still do. They're walking with their intended. Or rather, standing still, talking, not touching, but close enough that it makes something inside you twist. You want to look away, but you can't. It's like watching a door slowly close. You don't stay long. You turn down the path and walk away, fast, before anyone notices the tears you're holding back. Later that night, lying on the straw-stuffed mattress that's softer than the ache in your chest, you wonder if they feel it too, if they think of you, if they remember the alley, the dance, the tiny laugh you shared over sugared almonds, or if they've already folded you away, like a page in a story that didn't quite end right. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. You tell yourself everyone goes through this. You're not the first, and you won't be the last. But knowing that doesn't make it easier. The grief isn't loud, it's quiet, constant, like rain on a roof, like a song you can't forget. And so, the match proceeds. Slowly, politely. There's no passion, but no protest either. Your life begins to shift shape, accommodating someone new. You watch your feelings shrink, folding themselves neatly into the corners of your heart. They won't disappear, but they'll hide. They'll wait. Maybe one day they'll fade. Until then, you go on, because you must. The match has been accepted. There's no ceremony yet, no feast, no official banns read at the church door, but the understanding is in place. The families have spoken. Hands have been shaken. The neighbours already speak of you as a couple, though you've barely said more than a handful of awkward words to each other. It's strange, the way your future seems to be shaping itself without you, like watching someone else's cart pull away with your belongings inside. You're not unhappy, not exactly, but you're not happy either. You feel muted, like the colours of your world have faded to ash and clay, practical, sensible, dry. You catch glimpses of them now and then, the person you would have chosen, if choosing were a luxury you were ever afforded. They seem quieter lately, more subdued. Maybe they're just working more. Maybe they're trying to forget you, just as you've been trying to forget them. But you can't help noticing how their smile looks thinner, how they linger in silence a bit longer than they used to. Or maybe that's just your imagination, trying to build a bridge where only a memory remains. One morning, while tending to the hens behind the cottage, you find something tucked under the edge of the fence post. A small strip of cloth, faded but carefully tied with red thread. It's not signed. It doesn't need to be. You recognize the knot, the fold, the tiny stitched symbol near the corner. It's the same as the one you'd once given them. A reply, months too late, yet still warm somehow. You don't cry, but your breath catches, and for a moment, your fingers press the cloth to your lips before you tuck it away beneath your apron. A flicker, a quiet rebellion, a reminder. But even now, you can't act on it. You can't run. You can't change what's already begun to move forward. The wheels of tradition are slow, but they're relentless. Your parents begin collecting items for the dowry linens, cooking pots, a small goat if they can get one. They clean the house more often now. Guests stop by with well wishes. Your mother starts teaching you certain things to keep a hearth warm through winter, how to balance the weight of wet laundry so it dries faster, how to mask the scent of turnip stew with dried mint and rosemary. These lessons aren't cruel. They're gifts, in their own way. But every tip, every shared trick, feels like a nail in the coffin of what might have been. The church announces the first reading of the banns. It's done aloud, at the end of Mass, in front of the whole congregation. Your name is said beside his. No one claps, no one cheers. But there are nods, knowing glances, little murmurs of approval. You keep your head down. The name sounds foreign on the priest's tongue, like it doesn't belong beside yours. But it's there now, stitched into the public record. One mainstream historical fact. The reading of the banns was introduced to prevent secret marriages. It was the community's chance to raise objections if, for example, one party was already married elsewhere, or too closely related, or bound by prior vows. It made everything official, public, inescapable. After the third reading, you would be as good as wed. The countdown had begun. Some days, you feel calm, resigned. You convince yourself that maybe this path will bring peace, that love is only one part of life, and not even the most important. You think of couples who began their lives as strangers and still built something that lasted. Maybe fondness can grow. Maybe it doesn't have to burn bright. Maybe a slow, flickering light is enough to warm a home. But then come the nights, the long, cold ones when your thoughts wander to the sound of their laugh, the shape of their hands, the small way they used to tilt their head when listening. You remember the way your heart felt near them alive, raw, hopeful. You lie awake, eyes fixed on the wooden beams above your bed, tracing old cracks in the ceiling as if they might spell out a different ending. But the story is already written. One fringe tidbit. In certain parts of medieval Bohemia, couples who were deeply in love but unable to marry would carve initials into stones near rivers, believing the flowing water would carry their promises to each other wherever they were forced to live. No one knows how many such stones survived. Most were likely swept away or covered with moss, but the belief lingered, tucked into folk songs and quiet rituals passed between hearts that had no other sanctuary. Historians still argue how much emotion truly coloured medieval marriage. Some say most unions were built on duty, obligation, and the rhythm of shared survival. Others believe affection bloomed more often than we assume, nurtured by closeness and mutual dependence. But nearly all agree, love that defied custom was hard, sometimes dangerous, often tragic. You spend more time alone now. Not brooding, exactly just quiet. Your chores get done, your family is pleased, the neighbours stop asking if you're still holding out for something better. Everyone assumes you've made peace. You even start to believe it, until the second reading of the banns. It happens on a windy Sunday. The church is colder than usual. The candles struggle to stay lit, and just as the priest speaks your name again, there's a sounder cough, a shuffle, a murmur than silence. Nothing more. But for one terrible moment, you imagine someone standing, objecting, breaking the spell. You glance around. No one moves. Least of all them. They're not even here today. Or maybe they are, but hidden in the back, watching, hurting, silent. You leave the service feeling heavier than you arrived, but you keep walking. You keep moving forward because there's nothing else to do. This is the way of things. Wanting doesn't matter. Only what's done. Only what's proper. Still, you keep the cloth. You wear it secretly under your bodice, close to your heart. Not as defiance, not even as hope, just as memory. Because some love isn't meant to be shouted or written in ink. Some love lives quietly, like the glow of coals in a hearth long after the fire has burned out. The third reading of the banns passes without interruption. No objections, no sudden changes, no dramatic turn of fate. It's done. You're to be married in 7 days' time. Your mother spends the next morning scrubbing everything in sight walls, floors, even the underside of the wooden bench no one has looked under in years. You help her without complaint. You stitch quietly by the hearth. You answer your father's practical questions about moving your things into your soon-to-be husband's home. But inside, something feels brittle. Not broken just. Fragile in that way. Thin ice is when it looks solid, until the weight finally comes. The village buzzes with quiet excitement. There aren't many weddings here. They're expensive, even when simple. Yours will be modest. There'll be bread, broth, a sweet cake if your aunt can spare the honey, and a song or two. The church bells will toll. A neighbour's boy will throw flower petals, and your new husband's cousin will likely drink too much and fall asleep on the floor. It will all be perfectly acceptable, perfectly ordinary. And that's the part that aches the most. There's no space left for anything else. Not questions, not hopes, certainly not you know who. Still, you hold your silence. You smile when expected. You go to sleep each night whispering practical things to yourself like, he's kind, and it could be worse, and it won't matter in time. These aren't lies. Exactly, they're scaffolding, and you're trying your best to build something livable around them. Then one afternoon, 3 days before the wedding, you go to fetch water. The path to the well is muddy, the air still and warm, the sky low with the smell of coming rain, and you see them, not far off, standing by the blackthorn hedge, not moving, just waiting. You could keep walking. You know you should, but something in you shifts, and you pause. That pause stretches. Then, without thinking, you turn. You meet in the middle. No words at first, just the sound of the wind stirring the leaves, and the faint drumming of water in the bucket swaying at your side. Then, finally, they speak. Their voice is lower than you remember, Or maybe it's just the heaviness inside them that makes it sound that way. They ask if it's true. You nod. They ask if you're happy. You lie. It's not a bitter conversation. There's no blame, no begging, just two people with too much history and not enough future. You both know what's coming. You both feel the seconds slipping away. And you both want, desperately, to say the right thing. But there is no right thing. There's only this quiet, aching space between you, filled with everything that might have been. One mainstream historical fact: while premarital romantic attachment was common, the formal end of any such relationship when one party became betrothed to another was often considered emotionally binding. In some traditions, it was seen as dishonorable to continue even friendly contact with a former love. The idea was to avoid temptation, gossip, or scandal. And so, once a wedding was announced, most people never saw their might have been again. They reach out, not quite touching you, but close. You feel the warmth of their hand in the air between you. You remember every accidental brush, every quiet moment shared when the world still felt open. And then you do something unexpected. You take the cloth, the one they gave you, the one you've kept hidden for weeks, and press it gently into their palm. A full circle, a quiet thank you, a goodbye. They take it, eyes fixed on yours. Neither of you cries. You've already cried enough for 10 lifetimes, but your throat tightens as you step back. You murmur something, maybe a blessing, maybe just their name. Then you turn, walk away, and don't look back. That night, the rain finally falls. It drums on the roof, seeps under the door, turns the yard into a slurry of muck and crushed petals. Your mother frets over the wedding dress drying by the fire. You sit beside her, hands idle, thinking not about the wedding but about the moment by the hedge. It's the last time you'll speak to them. You know this as surely as you know your own name. One fringe tidbit. In parts of rural Italy, it was customary for brides to throw tiny tokens ribbons, beads, scraps of embroidery into rivers the night before their wedding. The idea was to let go of any past attachments or unspoken feelings. Some did it with joy, others with quiet tears, and some never threw anything at all. Historians still debate whether romantic grief like this had a place in medieval culture. On the surface, society demanded practicality, obedience, duty. But diaries, poems, songs, and oral traditions tell another story where longing thrived in silence, where people remembered old loves, even as they built new lives. Regret was not uncommon. It just had no room to be expressed publicly, so it went underground, becoming part of the private self. The day before the wedding, you sleep little. You rise early, bathe in water that's gone tepid by the time you're half done, and sit still while your mother braids your hair in slow, steady movements. The dress is stiff, the shoes pinch, and the borrowed necklace feels too cold against your collarbone, but you say nothing. You sit like stone. Your reflection in the polished pewter plate doesn't look like you. It looks like a version of you that someone else created. But then, you take a breath, and another. You remind yourself that your life is still your own, even if the path ahead no longer looks like the one you once imagined. You are not the first to make this walk with a heart full of shadows, and you will not be the last. Tomorrow, bells will ring. There will be bread and broth and blessings. People will laugh. You will smile. And beneath it all, tucked deep within your chest, there will be a quiet corner of your heart reserved for a carved token, a red thread, and a dance under lanterns that flickered like stars. You won't forget them. Not ever. The morning of your wedding arrives with the pale hush of dawn. The village stirs slowly, roosters crying into the pale sky, the sun still deciding whether to break through the grey. You sit on the edge of your straw-stuffed mattress, dress folded neatly beside you, hands resting in your lap. Outside, there's the distant sound of sweeping the neighbour tidying her doorstep, and your mother humming as she boils water for your morning wash. The air smells faintly of damp wood and rosemary. Today is the day. You don't feel nervous. Exactly. Just hollow. Like your heart has turned into a small, sealed chamber that nothing can reach. You let the morning unfold around you like a well-rehearsed ritual. Bath, hair, dress. Your mother adds a final touch, a simple wreath of dried flowers, slightly crushed at the edges but still fragrant. Lavender for calm, sage for wisdom, and a sprig of yarrow, which someone once said was for courage. You're not sure whether that last one is meant for love or survival. Either way, You accept it without a word. Your father barely speaks, but he squeezes your shoulder as you step out the door. Your siblings peek out from behind the cottage's curtain, wide-eyed and fidgety, and then you're walking slowly, deliberately down the dirt path toward the church. Every footstep feels like a page turning in a book you didn't write, but are still expected to finish. There are petals strewn on the ground, and neighbours smiling politely, and the low murmur of anticipation in the air. The church is small, sun filtering in through stained glass windows that cast coloured shadows on the floor. Your groom stands at the front, not grinning, not weeping, just watching you with a kind of steady uncertainty, as if he's still not sure whether this is real. You reach him. You stand beside him. The priest begins. One mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, weddings could be shockingly brief affairs. A few words exchanged in front of witnesses, a blessing from the priest, and that was it, you were married. The rest was formality and celebration. The true bond, according to church doctrine, was made by consent when the two of you gave yourselves to each other, freely and publicly. A contract, sealed by presence and prayer. You speak the words. You take the vows, you place your hand in his, and let the binding be done. You don't tremble, you don't falter. You stand, heart pounding dully, and nod when required. It's over in minutes, and when the bell's tolled to announce it, you try to smile. It almost works. Outside, there is clapping, a few cheers, and the clang of a jug being knocked over accidentally by a child. Bread is broken, ale is poured. People toast, and laugh, and dance on the packed earth. Your husband offers you a sip of cider, and you take it. He looks nervous, maybe even relieved. You can't tell what he's thinking, but you know he's trying, and that, in its own way, is a comfort. The day unfolds like a song you've heard many times before, pleasant, predictable, forgettable. There are no surprises, no sudden visits, no one running in to object, breathless and desperate. Just the plodding rhythm of duty, laced with kindness and numb acceptance. One fringe tidbit. In some parts of medieval Brittany, it was traditional for brides to visit a specific rock formation the day after their wedding. They'd press their palm to the stone and whisper the name of someone they once loved but could not marry, believing the earth would carry the memory away and leave only peace. No one knew when the custom began. It was simply something you did. Historians still puzzle over the role of affection in marriages like yours. Some point to household records and shared possessions as signs of teamwork and intimacy. Others cite ballads and folklore as evidence that longing was an everyday part of life, that love often lived outside of wedlock, unfulfilled but unforgettable. Maybe both were true. Maybe medieval people, like people now, simply did the best they could with what they had. That night, the house is quiet. You sit beside your new husband at the hearth. He speaks softly about the day, about the stew his aunt spilled, about how nervous he felt waiting for you. He's gentle, respectful, earnest. He doesn't ask too much, doesn't try too hard, just rests his hand on yours for a moment, then returns to watching the flames. You stare into the fire, unsure whether to feel comforted or swallowed whole. You go to bed. The blankets smell of cedar and smoke. The walls creak in the wind. You lie on your back, eyes open, staring at the shadows above. Your husband breathes slowly beside you, already half asleep. And somewhere far off, you imagine them the one who wasn't chosen, who now lives as a memory tucked in the corner of your chest like the last breath of a song no one sings anymore. You still wonder what life might have looked like with them, whether the struggle would have been worth it, whether love, no matter how strong, could have survived the weight of work, hunger, gossip and loss. There's no way to know. Only stories, only maybes, and the reality you live in now. And yet, you still keep the scrap of cloth, hidden beneath your bed, folded beneath your nightdress. You still remember their voice, their hand, the tiny, impossible ache that you carry like a tiny ember pressed deep beneath your ribs. Not every love story ends with marriage. Not every marriage begins with love. But life, somehow, continues. One day will follow the next. You'll rise with the sun, sweep the hearth, and walk the path to the well. Maybe, over time, the ache will fade. Or maybe it will become something quiet and permanent, like the hum of wind through trees. Always there, never forgotten. Now, let the fire dim. Let the thoughts soften. Let the flickers of longing slip into the cool mist of memory. where they can rest undisturbed. You've walked a long path tonight through glances, through secrets, through everything said in silence. You've seen how hearts beat differently beneath the weight of expectation, how a single touch could hold more truth than 1,000 words. And still, you made it. You survived what love looked like in a time where choice was scarce, where duty spoke louder than desire. Feel the hush now, the way night settles around your shoulders like a worn shawl, the kind your mother might have folded by the hearth. Outside, the stars hang quiet over the village rooftops, their light as soft as breath. The church bells are still, the laughter has faded, the hearth glows low. In this silence, remember, even the smallest love leaves an echo, even a forgotten ribbon, a hidden note, a dance beneath lanterns. They shape you, gently, quietly, like water shapes stone. You carry them, always not as burdens, but as quiet proofs that once you loved deeply, fiercely, honestly, and that is never lost. So now, close your eyes, let the story slip into your dreams, and when morning comes, carry only what you need. Good night, sweet dreams.